Thank you, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. How's the volume? I don't normally need a mic, so I might get overly excited and you might have to cover your ears at some point, but hopefully everybody can hear me as I go on here. But thank you, Beth, for the invitation to come out tonight and talk a little bit about the Shipwreck Museum and talk a little bit about this most recent shipwreck discovery out in Lake Superior. And we're going to go ahead and just get started here because I know we're kind of on a little bit of a time crunch here, but let me ask the question, and I always like to do this before I start a program. How many of you have ever been up to the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum before? Let me see you show me. That's great. I heard where is it? Well, I can tell you about that. So that's actually Whitefish Point you can see right there. That lighthouse, it was built in 1861. Abraham Lincoln was president actually when that was constructed. It's actually still an operating lighthouse. It didn't look too different than this very recently. We lost our last snow about 4 weeks ago, believe it or not. So we still have snow out in the woods and that sort of thing. Can you guess what we're dealing with up there right now? If I appear to be faint, I gave a lot of blood today at Whitefish Point. That's right, the mosquitoes are out of control. Our marketing people probably wouldn't be happy if I said this may not be the best time to go off and visit. Give it a couple of weeks and the mosquitoes will go away. But we had the question, where is the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum? Where is Whitefish Point? Well, if you take a look, we've got the Upper Peninsula right here, Lake Superior right here, and that is Whitefish Point right there. So all of your ship traffic coming in and out of Lake Superior have to go right past Whitefish Point, and that's the reason we have a lighthouse there in the first place. It was one of the first. There were two lighthouses built in 1849 on Lake Superior. Copper Harbor is the other one. And we always like to claim that we were the first, of course, right? The first one to be lit. They claim the same thing for any of you who've been out of Copper Harbor. But in any case, this Whitefish Point you can see right here in this stretch of land, and this is another reason why you could say the Shipwreck Museum exists, but also why there's so many lighthouses along here. This 80-mile stretch of beach, this shoreline, if any of you have been up there, have any of you ever been to Vermilion or Crisp Point, Deer Park, Muskellonge Lake? Pretty remote areas out there. If it's remote now, you can imagine what it was like in the 1890s or the 1870s. There really was just nothing up there. And for the most part, there's nothing up there now. That stretch, 80 miles, there's over 200 shipwrecks right in that area. If you count the bay in here, if we go back one slide, so count the bay and this stretch going right there, about 200 shipwrecks. And there's a variety of reasons for that. The weather, obviously a big factor. Most of those storms are coming in out of the northwest, and there's really no harbors to speak of outside of Grand Marais. And Grand Marais was such a tight harbor, it was hard for a lot of those ships to get in there. So when the ships were out there and a big storm brewed up, they really had no place to go. They would be caught out, they would often be driven ashore. So many shipwrecks right along that stretch that the United States Life Saving Service in 1876 built 4 stations along that shoreline. And that shoreline has come in later years to be known as the Shipwreck Coast. But if you look at newspapers even from the 1890s, you'll see that referenced as the graveyard of the Great Lakes, things like that. Now, there's a lot of graveyards of the Great Lakes. You'll see that in a lot of different areas. I'm not sure how much more dramatic our area might be, but like I said, roughly 200 shipwrecks, that kind of speaks for itself. And if any of you are familiar with Fred Stonehouse, I don't know, Beth, if you've ever had Fred come down and speak here before. Maritime historian, maritime author. He's put out over 30 books at this point, including one that we give to all of our staff dedicated right to this area just because there's so many shipwrecks in the area. We chronicle about a dozen of those shipwrecks inside the Shipwreck Museum itself. Going back as far as 1816, there was a ship called the Invincible. Probably a lesson in there to name your ship the Invincible. You're bound to get into trouble. That's the earliest one that we reference, and then all the way up to 1975. Anybody want to guess which shipwreck that might be? Exactly. The Edmund Fitzgerald, that's the one that everybody wants to know about. This is the 50th anniversary of the sinking of the Fitzgerald, so we had 27 media outlets lined up in the month of May alone to talk to us about the Fitzgerald, talk to us about what we plan to do to commemorate the loss of that ship and crew and so on. We often like to use the Fitzgerald as the shipwreck to introduce people to other Great Lakes shipwrecks. And depending on what statistic you look at, there could be anywhere from 6,000 shipwrecks in the Great Lakes to 10,000 shipwrecks in the Great Lakes. So there's a lot of other wrecks to talk about. But the Fitzgerald seems to be the one. that people really like to talk about. Now, the bell is right there. Many of you have probably seen that. That was recovered in 1995 at the request of a number of the Fitzgerald family members. Not all of them, but a number of them requested that something be brought up as a memorial. And Whitefish Point was the place, and the bell was chosen to be that object to bring up. And in turn, there was another bell with all the 29 crew members' names on it that were put down on that same pilot house of the ship itself. So that's down there right now. That's really kind of the centerpiece. I only say kind of because a lot of people come in and they see that giant Fresnel lens, that second order Fresnel lens up there, and sometimes they don't even see the bell. And they'll come back and ask our staff, where's the bell? And it's because they're often looking at that thing first. But really, for all practical purposes, it has become the centerpiece of the museum. And then we have a permanent exhibit dedicated to Fitzgerald itself. Other areas that we interpret, obviously the United States Life-Saving Service, that's a picture that was taken. There was a lighthouse keeper by the name of Charles Kimball. He was up there from 1883 to 1903. He took scads of pictures all over the Great Lakes, but primarily at the light stations where he was stationed. And he got a lot of them at Whitefish Point. Do you notice anything different about the lighthouse when you look at that? Note the color. Yeah, I mean, it's a black and white picture, but that tower is white. It's always been white, at least in my lifetime, but shortly after it was constructed, Civil War is going on at that point, but they painted it that darker color, almost like a black, dark gray color, in order for it to be more visible as the ships were passing in daytime. So that was kind of the day mark, you might call, of it. So yeah, the Lighthouse Service, then the old U.S. Weather Bureau building. So that history, how many have been to this one before? This is in Sault Ste. Marie. It's on the grounds of the Sioux Locks. Let me see a show of hands. See far less hands going up at this point. It's amazing how people don't know about this building. We could advertise the heck out of it. Even people that live in Sault Ste. Marie have no idea what we're talking about when we mention the Weather Bureau building. But if we say the American Merchant Marine Library, then they know exactly what we're talking about. After this stopped right around World War II being a Weather Bureau structure, they had the Weather Bureau out of the airport at that stage. This became an American Merchant Marine Library. It speaks to the different era compared to what we have now. Sailors would be able to check out books at the Sioux Locks, at this Merchant Marine Library, and then if they arrived in Detroit, or if they arrived in Chicago, or if they arrived wherever, there would be other Merchant Marine libraries all over the place, and they could turn books in there. It was kind of a pretty cool system. Yeah, we have pictures of a young man with a little red wagon full of books, taking it out to the ships, and then pictures of the guys smoking their cigarettes on the hatch covers, reading their books. Again, a very different era that we're talking about here, but that's another part of history that we interpret. And then some of our staff, you can see we are a 501c3 nonprofit. We have a staff of about 30. I wish that was closer to 35 right now because we're having a little trouble, but again, if you've been up to Whitefish Point, we're not really close to anything, and it is difficult sometimes to get staffing up there. Paradise is only so big, there's only so many people, and believe me, there's fierce competition for the best people up in the area. So we're slightly short on staff, but you can see them all around the little Fresnel lens right there. And then we also interpret the life-saving service history. How many are familiar with the life-saving service? If you are, raise your hand. See a few hands going up. Most of the time, people are not aware of it. It's a predecessor to the United States Coast Guard. Their entire mission was to watch the lake, watch the waterways, and if a ship were in trouble, they would go out and try to effect rescue. And that could be anywhere from using surf boats like you see in the picture right here, to in later years, and when the Coast Guard took over in 1915, you had the Revenue Cutter Service, Life-Saving Service combining in 1915. At that point, you had the formation of the United States Coast Guard. And we had a lifeboat station at Whitefish Point. We never had a life-saving station. They did the same thing. Different era, more modern technology, but in some cases using the same kinds of boats. But we just finished up a restoration on a motor lifeboat. It took about 8 years. If any of you have been to Murtaugh Boat Works in Hessel, where the Antique Boat Show takes place, they did most of the work for us on that. So, and we've opened up some new exhibits in recent years. This one is a shipwreck called the Daniel J. Morrell, 1966, Lake Huron. A crew of 29, there was one survivor, a man by the name of Dennis Hale. Some of you might have met Dennis through the years. He would come to places like this and do programs and tell stories about his ship, what happened that night, his 28 crew members that didn't make it, that kind of thing. He was really Very interesting speaker, and we opened up that exhibit in 2001. And then just a few weeks ago, we opened one on a shipwreck that most people have never heard of, called the A.A. Parker off of Grand Marais. It sank in September of 1903. It's just a classic story of a ship getting overwhelmed by the weather, but you mix in some other ingredients like the life-saving service coming to the rescue, and then other ingredients like the life-saving service needing to be rescued, and then a few dogs being rescued at the same time. So it's a great story, and that one we opened up here just a few weeks ago. As fascinating as all these stories are, we like to think, as fascinating as all these other shipwrecks are, what's the one shipwreck again everybody wants to hear about? The Edmund Fitzgerald, that's right. And why is that?
Because it's song.
I heard it, yep, you've all got it right, that's right. I think arguably that is the reason. That song hit number 2, Gordon Lightfoot's song, The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, hit number 2 on the Billboard Hot 100 in 1976, believe it or not. I think it lost out to Barry Manilow. I Write the Songs or something like that, which is, that's crazy, but that is true. So that kind of got it into the public consciousness, but there's other factors I think that make the Fitzgerald one that makes it stand out. I mean, this was a 729-foot ship that sank so quickly that they didn't have time to get a distress signal out. That's something right there. This was a pretty new ship, for sure. And then the investigations that followed, those made headlines. And then the multiple expeditions that went to this shipwreck, those were more headlines. And many of those expeditions, including Jacques Cousteau, if we all remember the Calypso and Jacques Cousteau, the undersea world of Jacques Cousteau, they went to the Fitzgerald. That wasn't their primary reason for being on the Great Lakes, but they did go to the Fitzgerald, they did study it, and they came back with the conclusion that the ship must have broken apart on the surface and sank. But then your next expedition said, no way, that's not how it couldn't have happened that way. And so all these things were making headlines, including controversies. Some of you might remember headlines where there was a private businessman from the Flint area who took another submersible down, and they claimed they found a body off of the bow area of the wreckage. That made headlines. The family members went bananas at that point, and of course they would, it makes sense. And then soon there were more headlines about how this being declared, it was declared a grave site, and that was due to a number of the families petitioning the government of Ontario and Canada, because this ship is in Canadian waters. So all these things added headlines, and then there's just the mystery. We don't know why it sank. We don't really know exactly what happened. So all these things, I think, kind of work together. And in its final moments, it might have looked something like this. It was right around 7:10 p.m., November the 10th, 1975, that ship disappeared off the radar screen of another ship that was following it, the Arthur M. Anderson, and they repeated hailing. They'd been talking to the ship all night, all day, and suddenly they couldn't get it to return the hails. They couldn't see it. They couldn't see its lights, anything else. It was gone at that point. So I think all these things work together. And at this point, there's over 35 books that have been written on the Fitzgerald. There's more coming out this year. So it's certainly in the public imagination. And I'm talking about the Fitzgerald a lot right now. So I want to talk about the Western Reserve here in a second, but I will say this. The Fitzgerald and the Western Reserve have certain things in common. Both of these ships were pretty new. Both of these ships were record-breaking ships. Both were some of the latest, the last word in technology of the day. They both were very innovative in how they were built. There were a lot of things that they had in common, and if this were, say, 1913, or if this were 1900 or whatever, maybe I could be doing a program for people about the Western Reserve because it had that same kind of public fascination. Now, you didn't have someone like Gordon Lightfoot writing a song about it, but it did reach into the public imagination, and I'll tell you why as we keep going. Now, if this is a story that most people know about, what most people don't know about, at least with us at the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum, is our marine operations. So we actually do have a research vessel. It's a retired U.S. Army Corps of Engineers research boat that we take out whenever the weather allows, and it's primarily on Lake Superior. It goes back to the core of what the organization started with. The Shipwreck Society started in 1978, and it really was built around the idea of exploring some of these shipwrecks, in some cases taking things off of them too, prior to the idea that it became state law that you couldn't pull things off of these shipwrecks, 1980. But the Shipwreck Society started by teachers, historians, scuba divers with the idea of, again, documenting a lot of these shipwrecks, and in a lot of cases, saving things off of them that other divers were actually taking off of them, and suddenly you might have a binnacle off of a very unusual ship that ends up in somebody's, I don't know, garage or something for the next 40 years, that kind of thing. So the idea was to bring them up, and my predecessor, a man by the name of Tom Farnquist, was sort of leading the charge with a lot of other people helping to make this a reality with this organization. There's the research vessel right there. It's just a little over 50 feet long. Like I said, former Army Corps of Engineers research vessel. Probably hard for you to see, but there is a sonar unit right on the back there. And this is most of what this boat is doing. Mostly out searching grids on Lake Superior. Typically it takes 2 of our crew, or maybe 3 possibly, to go out and put that sonar in the water. And what ends up happening, our Director of Marine Operations, a man by the name of Daryl Rattel, in the winter spends a lot of time setting up these grids, essentially out in the lake, right? And what that means is there's an area that we will set these coordinates, and it might take us 2 weeks to search that area. The Boyd is not a fast boat at all. But our sonar that we have actually can see out about a half mile on each side. So underwater, we're painting the bottom of the lake, so to speak, with sound waves. And then if anything is on the bottom, those sound waves bounce back. And on our monitors inside the David Boyd, inside our research vessel, you might see something appear that has a big shadow on it. And that tells us there's something down there. And a lot of times, this could be many, many days of nothing, not seeing anything, kind of boring, eating a lot of donuts, drinking a lot of coffee, trying to stay awake, because sometimes we could be out there for 12 or 14 hours at a time. And that's why we don't really get a lot of volunteers wanting to help in the search. But our Director of Marine Operations will argue that when we find something, then there'll be like 100 people lined up, including me. I don't get out there as much as I would like. I don't know if he gets the idea. I'd rather be bored out on the lake than be reviewing financial documents in my office or something like that. It would still be more fun being out on the water. But in the picture you see, this is our operations manager, Sarah Wiley from the museum. This is Dan Ertel. He's our #1 crewman, kind of do-it-all guy. His brother, Daryl Ertel, is actually the Director of Marine Operations. We can put out over, and it's typical, we'll have 1,500 feet of cable out with that, what we call towfish. Looks like a big torpedo. That's what you see right here. And that's what we'll be towing. We have up to 1,800 feet. And like I said, we can be out there for hours at a time towing it. A lot of days we don't find anything. It's often a lot of early starts, getting up at 5 a.m., whatever, to get out of the water. Most beautiful mornings, very typically. We have to have very, very smooth water to be out there to use this equipment. Have you ever had Rick Mixter come out here and do a program, by the way? Yeah. That's Rick right there. He's one of our board members. And if he happens to think that we're on to something, then he'll come up out of the Lower Peninsula, out of his area, and join us. And that was a day that we were actually going out to the Western Reserve. It took us about 3 hours to get out there before we could do this and before we could launch our ROV. That's this yellow thing you see. This is not our entire crew. There's a few of us that are crew, but this was 2023, and National Geographic actually came out to do a program on shipwrecks on the Great Lakes, and they talked a little bit about what we were doing. Did anybody see that, by the way? I see one person nodding that I can see. How about the Discovery Channel? 2 weeks later, Discovery Channel came out. Josh Gates, Expedition Unknown, I think. Again, there's Expedition X Unknown. I kind of get them mixed up. But okay, see, a lot of people caught that program, so that's okay. But that's part of the National Geographic group. That's our ROV. You see the yellow right there. And this is the cool thing. In a lot of these shipwrecks we're finding, we're often the first eyes to view these shipwrecks, in some cases over 100 years, 125 years. We're really the first people to see these things. And I'll give you a couple of examples here. First one is a shipwreck called the Atlanta. And typically, these shipwrecks are not going to beat you over the head and tell you what vessel it is. The Atlanta went down in 1891. It was a relatively new schooner barge, but our ROV was climbing up the side. We've got these high-definition cameras, high-intensity lighting. We couldn't believe our eyes as we could see this gold leaf on the name board on the side of the ship. What you're not hearing is the audio with this. People are going berserk inside the cabin because, again, we've been out there for a while and we were trying to figure out what the ship was. What we found, the Atlanta was one of the examples, one of the options, I guess, in that area that it could have been. But this is really unusual. Even Rick Mixter himself said he had never seen anything quite like this as far as how clear this is. The other thing on Lake Superior that I have to point out too, do you notice anything missing? Is there not something, there's something that is missing on the hull of this vessel?
Muscles.
Exactly, that's right. We don't have the zebra mussels, we don't have the quagga mussels. Here's the Seldon E. Marvin, forgive the misspelling here, Seldon, it should be an E-N. But this is another one that was pretty clear. Oh wait, now you're hearing some of the excitement here in the background there. Because we thought it might have been another vessel called the Annie M. Peterson. These all sank in 1914. It was November 19th, 1914. 3 ships all together sank in the same storm. There was a ship called the C.F. Curtis that was towing the Annie Peterson and the Seldon E. Marvin. They were towing these other 2. So the Curtis and the other 2, the consorts, they all sank in the same storm. There were no survivors out of this. So we were fortunate that same summer, 2021, we found the Curtis. Then we found the Seldon E. Marvin. So we're still looking for the Annie M. Peterson at this point. But we think that one may have been driven ashore, and it might be under the sand somewhere and is probably disintegrated. But yeah, we were so excited when we saw that name on the side. Yeah, it's hard to describe because you're only seeing this little, you know, and then the C.F. Curtis. This is the vessel that was towing them. This one is a little bit harder, but we figured we knew what it probably would be. These are all wooden hulled vessels that we're talking about. And what ended up giving this one away was the Heinz Lumber Company painting on the side of the hull. You could just barely make out Heinz Lumber Company. Edward Heinz, I believe it was, he was in competition with C.F. Curtis. C.F. Curtis had originally owned the ship. They had been in competition with each other. So oddly, C.F. Curtis's name sort of disappeared, even though that was the name of the ship. But you could see the Edward Heinz Lumber Company on the side of it. We knew what we had at that point. So that was kind of a big find, because people have been looking for these wrecks for a while. Great story. This is a lot of maritime lore up in this area. And the other interesting thing about it, this one there were no survivors to interview, so there was really no idea what had happened to these ships. And they'd last been seen off of Grand Island in that area. But in any case, these are the kinds of things we get to see. But the Western Reserve, this is a ship that we had wanted to find for a long time. Our Director of Marine Operations, Daryl, says that he'd been looking for 35 years to try to find this ship. This was a very, very important ship in its day. And like I alluded to a little bit earlier, this was a record-breaking ship of its time. It was an all-steel ship. If not the first all-steel ship on the Great Lakes, it was one of the first. It was a very, very fast ship. It was called the Greyhound of the Inland Seas by how quickly it was getting from one port to the next. It was owned by this millionaire family, a man by the name of Peter G. Minch. Peter George Minch. His sister married into the Steinbrenner family. So think of Henry Steinbrenner, think of George Steinbrenner. Their ancestor was Peter G. Minch and Anna Minch, and so on and so forth. So this ship was kind of a big deal when it was built in Cleveland in 1890. The Cleveland Shipbuilding Company, there were 2. This was steamship number 9 that would become the Western Reserve. And steamship number 10 was the W.H. Gilcher, its sister ship that would also be operating out there and would also be breaking records and hauling all kinds of cargoes. This is one that we wanted to find just badly enough, and our development officer, Sean Lay, maybe some of you have met Sean, he used to live in the Petoskey area for a number of years. Sean asked, hey, can I write an article about this shipwreck for our Shipwreck Journal? We're a membership organization, we have this publication that we put out. I said, sure, it's a great story. We're not going to just limit ourselves to shipwrecks we've actually found. That would really be limiting us, period. So he wrote this really interesting article about the Western Reserve, and it is one that other organizations that are out looking for shipwrecks have been trying to find as well, just because in its day, this ship was very, very important. There weren't many pictures taken of this ship, and there are pretty good reasons for that. This is a photograph that was colored by a man by the name of Bob Campbell. Bob is a shipwreck researcher. The earlier picture that I showed at the Fitzgerald, that showed it on a very clear day, it was on the water, very famous photograph of the Fitzgerald, he took that picture. It was actually the summer of 1975.
What was the overall length?
Of this ship?
Yes.
300 feet.
It's small.
It is small, but actually I'm going to go through that. There's all kinds of little statistics I'll go through here. Relatively small, but in the day it wasn't that small. So 1892, this is a pretty big, fast ship. So you think a lot of those wooden lumber hookers and things like that that were operating. The passenger liners, that was a little bit different, but for ships like this, yeah, I don't know if I would say it was too small for its day, but compared to ships of today, certainly, yeah. There were no 1,000 footers operating back then. But when it was launched, this made big headlines, and I'm not sure if you could read that, but the launch of the steel steamer Western Reserve, it says a large crowd witnessed the launch of the steel steamer Western Reserve built for P.G. Minch and others at the yard of the Cleveland Shipbuilding Company yesterday afternoon. The word was given promptly at 3 o'clock, and she went in very smoothly, both ends striking the water at the same time. The Western Reserve is the largest ship, the largest vessel ever built at this port. Their dimensions: length overall 318 feet, length of keel 300 feet, beam 41 feet, molded depth 25 feet. She is 1 foot wider than the steamer Pontiac, turned out by the same company. The latter vessel has gained a reputation of being one of the largest carriers and fastest vessels on the lakes, and the Western Reserve is calculated to carry 300 tons more on the same draft, and her lines, being finer, will develop about the same speed or triple expansion engine, has cylinders of 24 by 42, so on and so forth, Scotch boilers, usual barge style cabin. So it's going into more details. 8 full hatches on the spar deck, modern appliances for loading and unloading. Captain Albert Myers, so commander, he was a famous captain of the day, and William Seaman will be the chief engineer. Both were formerly the steamer Philip Minch. The new boat will be ready for her first trip in about 4 weeks. So this was the summer of 1890 that we're talking about. And this ship was coming online with the idea of really, in some ways, being the flagship of the Minch fleet at that point. It was going to be the newest, it was going to be the safest. Again, it was all steel at that point. Another comparison, think of the Fitzgerald. It was the flagship of the Columbia Transportation Division of the Ogle Bay Norton Company at that point. It had the most modern appliances. There was an article I read, Detroit Free Press from 1958, that said the old-time sailors would whistle in amazement at the Fitzgerald. I think they were probably doing the same thing for the Western Reserve when it was launched as well. Again, the idea of something that fast, all steel, kind of unheard of at that point. Again, some of the newspaper headlines: the Inland Greyhound, the safest boat on the inland seas. You can see that painting right there, Father Dowling. Are any of you familiar with Father Edward Dowling? No, he was a Jesuit out of Detroit. He was also a maritime historian, and he has painted so many ships across the years. And believe it or not, the gallery, most people don't know that, the gallery of the Shipwreck Museum itself was named in his honor because he was such a prolific researcher and historian. But we talk about breaking records, and if you look at some of these old newspaper articles from the day, look, there's one right there. The Western Reserve breaks the late grain carrying record. Chicago wheat rate advances 3 cents, so on and so forth. But the bottom line is it was breaking records carrying grain, carrying coal. You can see in that other newspaper article right there. And there was even a reference that I found that I haven't put in here where it was coming out of Marquette with an iron ore carrying record as well. So it was making a name for itself shortly after it was launched. And this would have been probably the summer of 1891 that it was making, really breaking a lot of these records early in 1892. The ship was owned by Peter George Minch. He was a sea captain in his own right. His father had started the Minch fleet, Philip Minch. But he was the one that built it up to what it was becoming. It was becoming a huge, huge shipping company. And like so many of us think today, how many of us, all of us have been in the position where you're working, you feel like you just need to get away, right? You need to get away from it all. That's exactly what Peter Minch was thinking in the summer of 1892. And I guess if you own a fleet of ships, why not? Let's take a cruise, and it's summer. Let's just get away from Cleveland for a little while. Now, Cleveland has a bit of a reputation. I think it's a great city. It's pretty cool. Have you been to Cleveland in recent years? I'm not part of their CVB or anything like that, but I think Cleveland's come a long way. But Cleveland back in the day was one of the wealthiest cities in the country. It absolutely was. But yet this was Ohio. It was Cleveland. It was hot in the summer. I grew up around the Columbus area. It does get hot down there, especially compared to where I am now, up in UP. We were going crazy the last few days with this 87 degree. We had this high of 87, but it was 55 this morning when I got to Whitefish Point. So they didn't have that happening a whole lot in Cleveland. But I think Peter G. Minch thought to himself, you know what, let's just get the family. And I'm leading up to this cruise now, this trip they were taking. After the fact, a number of newspaper articles talked a little bit about what Peter G. Minch was thinking. And the millionaire owner had long had the thought of a trip on the lakes as a means of escaping from the business cares for a few days. He would take his wife and youngest children with him, an old sailor himself. Naturally, he thought what might happen. So, of his fleet of 14 vessels, he chose the one that he considered the staunchest. His opinion was that every vessel on the lakes, the Western Reserve, was the safest boat on the inland seas. As guests, he invited his wife's sister, Mary Inglebray, and her daughter, Bertha. That photograph is probably the most famous of the Western Reserve, and this is pretty much exactly what it would have looked like in 1892 when it left Cleveland to make its way up the lakes. That picture right there, look how high it's sitting up in the water. It has no cargo in it at that point, so it's running light, running in ballast. That's what it would have looked like. Cleveland itself, you have to think again, think about how people dressed back then, right? Think of a hot summer day. I actually looked at the historical weather records from 1892, summer of 1892. They had a lot of days in the low 90s, mid 90s. Think of how people dressed. Think of how hot it would have been. Air conditioning didn't come along for about another 10 years at that point, so people were, no doubt, really, really hot. And really, if you think about it, even if you didn't own a fleet of ships, think about places like where we are right now with the resorts. Look at above you. In some of these, you see images of these steamships and these passenger liners. Places like Harbor Springs, places like Mackinac Island in particular, Grand Hotel. Think about 1887 that was built, and all these steamships were bringing people up from Cleveland to Detroit and Chicago and Milwaukee, these hot cities to get people away, bring them up where it's nice and cool in the summer, that kind of thing. That was the idea that many people had. Well, for Peter G. Minch himself, he had his own fleet. He's going to pick the safest one, and so the stage was set at this point. There's a lot of artwork of the Western Reserve that came out after the fact. You see far more artwork than you see photographs at this point. And again, you'll understand why here in a few minutes. So the stage was set here, the Western Reserve. It was August 28th, 1892, and the family loads up on board the Western Reserve. You had a crew on board, obviously, as well, totaling 28 people. 6 family members, 22 crewmen on board this ship. They're running light, no cargo. Their destination is going to be up in 2 harbors clear on the other side of Lake Superior. So August 28, 1892, they leave the Cleveland area. They pass up through Detroit, past Port Huron, make their way up through Lake Huron, up through the lower St. Mary's River, into Sault Ste. Marie. At that point, they're going through the locks. This is the day would have been August 30th, early afternoon, 1892. This picture shows 1896 when the Poe Lock first opened up. But they're cruising through, and a newspaper later made a reference to Cleveland Plain Dealer that never was there a jollier party on board a steamer than on the Western Reserve when she passed through the canal Tuesday night. Captain Minch and his 2 children stood upon the bridge. All were in the best of spirits. They must have been having a blast. I'm sure they were eating well. The kids were out on the deck. Everybody's just enjoying the air that was coming off the lakes and just generally having a fine time, having a nice cruise. So this was August 30th, early afternoon, going through Sault Ste. Marie. At that point, they had to make their way up into Whitefish Bay. You could see right there. And at that point, something started to change a little bit. There was literally a sea change taking place at that point. Captain Albert Myers, Captain Peter G. Minch, they both kind of conferred. The weather was getting a little bit rougher. It's a little bit harder on the ship when there's no cargo on board. Again, it's riding higher up, even though they were in ballast. So within sight of the Whitefish Point lighthouse, they dropped anchor. They decided to drop anchor. It was just bad enough. Let's just wait it out and see what happens. That's pretty common these days, too. It's not unusual. Many of you, if you've been up there in the fall, even in the summer, sometimes we'll see 2 or 3 ships in the bay with their anchors dropped. That's more common now, I think, after the Fitzgerald sank. I don't know how common that was before. But in this case, Captain Minch and Captain Meyer. Captain Meyer's son was a wheelsman on board as well, so they both had family on board. So let's drop the anchor. Let's just wait and see if things level out a little bit. We don't know exactly how many hours they waited out there, but I think at one point they just determined this isn't getting any worse. Let's just pull up the anchor and let's head out into the lake. And that's exactly what they did. They went right up around, past Whitefish Point, past the lighthouse. Charles Kimball would have been that keeper at the time. He might have seen them passing. Still would have been daylight. They started heading their way up. And here's what must have been happening at this point. That ship, with no cargo, was taking a beating out of the lake. And so you can imagine everybody's below decks. A gale was blowing at that point. A gale was blowing, although some other ships in the area at the time said it wasn't that bad. But a gale was blowing, that ship is taking a pounding. So imagine this. People are below decks, the family members are below decks, and they're just, I guess, wanting to stay dry and hope that the weather smooths out pretty soon. Well, by the time we got to about 9 o'clock that evening, this is what started to happen. So the evening of August 30th, 1892, just about 9 p.m. This is artwork by a maritime artist by the name of Bob McGreevy. And you could just see what's starting to happen. This is literally what started to happen to this nearly brand new ship. The ship started to break into at that point. They're 60 miles northwest of Whitefish Point at that stage. They are far away from any help at that point. I think they all probably figured out, especially the captain, Captain Meyer, up in the pilot house. There was a wheelsman by the name of Harry W. Stewart, who was up there as well. I think they all knew, we've got to get everybody to lifeboats now. This ship is not going to survive. I mean, imagine the shock that everybody's in at this point, particularly the captain, the crew, Peter Minch. Can you imagine? He's got his family on board. This must have been just a horrifying realization at that moment. So what ended up having to happen at this stage was, you know, they are up in the pilot house, the officers, Captain Meyer, wheelsman Stewart, they had to get all the way back. And this included the family members too, because the family members' cabins would have been up in the forward area of the ship. So everybody had to try to get back there, and they must have gotten the family back there very, very quickly. Because one of the last ones to cross over this crack that was getting wider and wider, and for some unknown reason, the ship was still going full speed ahead, full steam ahead. We don't understand this. We have no explanation, unless something got confused, because once that ship started to break in two, the communications between the area where the engine room is back here and the captain and the pilot house up there, maybe the communication got mixed up, and you would think the guys in the engine room would have realized something bad was happening as well. So what ended up happening, Harry Stewart was one of the last ones to cross over. This, Bob McGreevy tried to kind of illustrate what was happening, but Stewart talked about having to jump a 3-foot gap as this ship was going up and down and the waves, everything else. The man probably is very lucky that he lived through that moment right there, but he was able to jump that crack, got back to the lifeboats, and this is what was probably seen next. Again, no one was taking pictures of these things, but Bob McGreevy can illustrate this for us. Both lifeboats were launched safely, and one remark of Harry W. Stewart was that everybody was very calm. Everybody was calm. They got the women and children into the lifeboats first. They got the women and children into lifeboat number 2. That was a wooden lifeboat. Lifeboat number 1 was a steel lifeboat, interestingly enough. That was most of the crew, or a good part of the crew in that. As soon as the number 1 lifeboat got in the water, it immediately turned over. And Stewart was in the number 1 lifeboat. He was one of only 2 crew that were pulled out of the water, out of the metallic lifeboat, the metal lifeboat. Stewart just dodged death again. So he was pulled on board the number 2 wooden lifeboat. So now you've got an overloaded lifeboat, the wooden one. Again, they're 60 miles away from Whitefish Point. They're probably closer to 30, 35 miles away from that southern shoreline. One thing that Captain Myers was gone at this point, but his son Carl was the other one, the other wheelsman that was pulled into this wooden lifeboat. They would have known that there were 4 life-saving stations. Remember I mentioned those a few minutes ago? So if they could get to that shoreline, they might be able to get to safety and get to near, or at least get near one of those life-saving stations, and maybe somebody could come out and help them. So at this point, it's still daylight, right? So right around 9 o'clock, it was 10 minutes from the time that things started cracking up to the point where it went to the bottom. 10 minutes. So, but again, everybody got into lifeboats, but unfortunately that number 1 lifeboat overturned. Only 2 survivors. Now everybody's in the number 2 lifeboat, and now it starts to get dark. And a gale is still blowing out there. If it would have been daytime, maybe that would have been a better situation because passing ships might have seen them. Yes?
What was the wind direction at that time?
Coming out of the northwest, but it was shifting as you read. And this is hard too, and I'll explain why it's hard. I mean, part of it is, you might get me off on a tangent here with primary sources, but sometimes if you're researching these newspaper articles, you'll read one thing in one newspaper, you'll read something that contradicts it in the next. But we have a really good, I'm going to give something away here, we're going to have a really good witness here before this is all said and done, coming out of the northwest here. But it's getting dark, right? Can you imagine what's going through their minds at this point? That brand new ship, practically brand new ship, just broke up and sank in 10 minutes. The good part of the crew, half the crew's gone at this point. The kids in the lifeboat. This is a scary situation, and it's dark now. It's dark, and this gale is still blowing. Well, they almost had salvation at one point. A ship called the Nishodo passed really close by to them, but it's dark. They have no lights, no flares, nothing that they could get the attention of that ship that's passing at that time. They talked about the idea, or one individual talked about the idea that they tried to light one of the ladies' shawls to at least have a light, something that they could wave around. They screamed and yelled for half an hour to try to get the ship's attention. It's almost like something out of a movie here. And that ship just disappears in the distance. So that had to be heartbreaking. But they were fortunate that they were able to keep this boat upright. They were able to keep it going. And they did make it within about 1 mile, roughly, of the shoreline. They had been pulling on these oars. They had been bailing all night using their hats, using whatever they could do to try to bail this water, because waves were constantly coming into this lifeboat, this wooden lifeboat that they were in at this point. They knew that they were probably pretty close to one of these life-saving stations, and the one that it ended up that they were closest to, but not close enough. Not close enough that one of the life-saving service crewmen that might have been on a beach patrol or up in an observation tower or watchtower might have been able to see them. They were getting closer. They knew they were able to see land, because you can be pretty far offshore and you can still see that shoreline for sure. But here's what ended up happening next, and this is the hardest, this is the most heartbreaking part of this. They made it that close. They got within 1 mile of the shoreline, and that boat overturned. Boat overturned, so they're all in the water at this point. For some inexplicable reason, not everybody had life jackets on at that point. And you keep hearing me talking about Harry W. Stewart, right? The wheelsman at this point. He was able to grab one of these in the water. When it got overturned, one of these life jackets was very close to him. He was able to put it on. That's a hard thing to do. Put a life jacket on in the water. He was a young guy, strong. He was also a very strong swimmer at the same time. So at one point, he made a reference to the fact that he and Carl Myers, the captain's son, the other wheelsman, these two wheelsmen in the ship, were out there trying to get closer to the shoreline. But if you've ever been near, the ocean or on one of these Great Lakes when these waves are crashing in, not something you want to be swimming in, for sure, especially if you don't have a life jacket on. And the only way we really knew what was happening next was because of Harry W. Stewart. And this is going to be hard for me to read here, but this is the log from the Life-Saving Service keeper, the guy in charge, Keeper J.H. Fram from Deer Park, that station. And you could read, at 2:30 p.m., wheelsman Harry W. Stewart of the steamer Western Reserve arrived at station with the following information. That steamer broke in two, 60 miles west of Whitefish Point, about 20 miles offshore, at 9 p.m., August 30th. The crew took to their yawl boat, total number 27. The owner, wife, 3 children, and a lady inclusive. Boat capsized at 7:30 a.m. About 1 mile offshore, as far as he knowed, was the only man saved swimming to shore. I ordered the crew once to follow up the beach to Grand Marais. I then gave him stimulants and dry clothing and provided for his comfort and proceeded after the crew, asking Mr. Stewart to remain at the station until my return. Found 5 life belts, 4 oars, and boat number 2, that's that wooden lifeboat, within 5 miles of Grand Marais, but no bodies. I arrived at Grand Marais at 11 p.m., remained there until morning, no patrols, crew away I read that, maybe rescue J.H. Fram Keeper. This is how the world found out about what happened to the Western Reserve. Was the idea that Harry W. Stewart was able to, in some of these newspaper articles and some of the in-depth interviews that he gave to the reporters of the day, many of which gathered in Sault Ste. Marie when he was brought back, being the only survivor, they wanted this story. So he did a lot of different versions of the story, but there's a number of commonalities in these particular versions, but this was the first that anybody had heard. There's Harry W. Stewart right there. Interestingly enough, he stayed with the Minch Fleet after this. I'm kind of skipping ahead now. But he became a captain in the Minch Fleet. He became a captain. He served for another couple decades on the lakes. We actually met some of his descendants. We put a press release out last September on this shipwreck, and we actually had descendants of Harry W. Stewart reach out to us. This particular picture right here, they had never seen before of their ancestor. And then they shared a bunch of pictures of him with us that we had never seen before either. So it was really, really kind of a cool thing. But the only reason we know about this is because of this man. Those people that reached out to us wouldn't be here today if he had not survived. The man had an angel on his shoulders that night. He survived that crack that he jumped over. He survived his lifeboat being turned over, and he was one of two that was pulled in. He survived being in that water. Had this been any other time of year, had this been May, had this been November or December, he wouldn't have survived. He would have died from exposure. So he was pretty darn lucky. This was August that we're talking about. The man was very lucky that he actually survived. So let's turn the clocks ahead. 132 years later, it's July 2024. The David Boyd is going out on the Lake Superior. It's a very particularly smooth day, but a very busy day out on the lake. That's Dan Ertel, you can see right here. He's our #1 crewman, first mate, I guess you could call him. And there's Daryl Ertel. The Ertel brothers are in the David Boyd. They're going up 60 miles northwest of Whitefish Point. They had just been the week before talking about the Western Reserve. And it's one Dan has wanted to find for a number of years. And the area they wanted to search in for the Western Reserve, this is true, I'm not making this up, they couldn't search in that area because of all the ship traffic that was coming through. So they had to divert to this little triangle that they really didn't have any intent on doing anytime soon. They were probably going to do it this year or next year because they weren't really sure if anything would be in that area. But it wasn't far from where the Western Reserve should have been. So they get that sonar in the water and they start towing, and it wasn't a long, I forget exactly how long they were out there at that point. This is practically out in the middle of the lake at this point. But they're towing, and on the screens, Daryl took notice of a little something right here. And now the question is, are you going to be able to hear what happens next here? Let me turn up the volume. Beth, the microphone you were using, the handheld,
Yes.
could I borrow that real quickly?
Yeah.
I just want to put it, let me start it and see if we can hear it here.
Well, it's July 22nd, 2024.
Thanks, Beth.
We haven't found anything yet this summer. We got 2 or 3 targets on this last pass. We're going by the first one that looks the best. It's around just over 500 feet of water. The boat should be going over the target in 500 feet. So we'll know if it's something when the boat goes over.
These two don't normally talk a lot. So this is big conversation here. So you can see the screen is looking at
Well, we got something on the depth sounder. Something's coming up there, Dan, on the depth sounder. See that? That's a good sign. That's a good sign. We'll take a closer look.
So the depth sound is almost like a fish finder kind of thing, but we can see something that's up off the bottom.
Look at that. We got a shipwreck. We got a shipwreck. Finally. I thought I was going to have to lay myself off here. All right. Now we'll wait for it to come up on the side scan. How far off the bottom is it coming up, Dan? 490 feet deep. No, how far off the bottom is it standing? 40 feet. And when I measured it with the side scan, I thought 45 foot it came up. That's pretty tall for a shipwreck. Come off the bottom. So we gotta make sure the side scan's above that. We're at 63 feet off the bottom right now. You can watch the screen here. We're gonna go right over the top of it, so we'll split it, but it should show up on both sides, and you'll be able to tell if it's man-made or not.
Is that black line the camera or something?
So, are you talking about the black line right down the middle?
Yeah.
So that's what's called the water column. You can't see directly below the towfish or the sonar and stuff, we
It's
see out on each
69
side of
feet right
it.
now.
So sometimes we'll see bits of the shipwreck sticking out on both, or on each side, or each other
So
side.
you can actually
They can
slow
typically
down
see out
these
about a half
steps.
mile on each side. They're going super slow right now. The towfish is getting
We're
lower and
still
lower
about
in the water.
1,000 feet away from the ship with the side scan.
Yeah, it takes a little while.
Potential shipwreck.
Don't want to get overconfident.
Bannockburn.
Does that mean anything to anybody? I'll explain that. That's another shipwreck we're looking for.
Looks broke up, whatever it is. We're about 400 or 500 feet away from it.
About 30. Yeah, not just for us, but he was
We're
doing it
78
well
feet
before
off
he
the bottom.
joined
Can
us,
you
so.
slow down a little bit more, Dan? Okay.
So if he slows down the towfish, that torpedo
Yeah,
is closer to the bottom, we can get a closer look at the wreck itself and get a better view of
It's
it.
getting deeper. It's almost 600 feet deep now. When we started this video, it was only 500 feet deep bottom. Here comes some debris. Usually you get debris all around the shipwreck. Well, we're getting debris over here right now. We should, oh, right there's the stern of the shipwreck or the bow. We got a shipwreck. We got a shipwreck. Definitely got a shipwreck. Look at, you can see the railing in the shadow. There's the cargo holds. 1, 2, 3, 4. We're getting it on the 900 kilohertz. Really nice. Look at it, it's broken half. Being broken half, it could be the Charles Sheffield or the Western Reserve. Either one. The Sheffield was hit by the North Star and could have broken half because of the collision, and the Western Reserve was supposedly broken half while it was sinking by the one survivor. Well, there you go, sports fans. Finally, on the 22nd of July, we got a shipwreck. Last year, Dan and I found the Harrington like the 22nd of May. So it's been a while since we found one, but we got a shipwreck. Signing off.
So the last time I've done this program 2 other times. The last time I did it, somebody asked, do they always film themselves like this? And they actually do. Because what we do is we have all our shipwreck files, and so we figure 40 years from now, that's all going to be there. Plus, I think Daryl, even though he claims to not like to be, and I'm on camera now, he's going to hear all this, but he likes to, I think he likes to ham it up a little bit when we find a shipwreck. So here's what happened next. Well, actually, before we go too far beyond it, it was hard for you to probably see what was on the screen. So I'll give you a couple of views here of what they were seeing. And this is amazing. We've never seen a shipwreck exactly like this before because literally the bow area is resting on top of the stern area of the ship. So this is a really, really kind of unusual ship. Like you overheard him say it's like 600 feet of water at this point. So literally when this ship was breaking up, it slowly went to the bottom, 600 feet of water, and that bow area just rested and landed right on top of the stern area. Stern area is partly buried at this point. Now, you might remember a little bit earlier I said that Daryl would make the reference that not many people always want to come out and help search because you could be out there for hours, not a whole lot happens. But yet, when it's time to go out and look at the shipwreck, then you get a scene like this where everybody shows up. But that's partly, we have to do it this way because to launch the ROV, you can launch this sonar with about 2 people. It's better to have 3, but 2 you can do it. But to launch the ROV takes a much bigger group of people. So we had researchers, Dan Fountain, you can see right here. There's Dan Ertel, he's our first mate. This is a gentleman by the name of Schmidt, John Schmidt. He's actually the descendant of a shipwreck captain of a vessel called the Jupiter. Corey Atkins, many of you probably know Corey. Does that name ring a bell? Corey Atkins, he used to be on TV 9 and 10 for about 20 odd years. He was in charge of their photojournalism. He works with us. There's me, that's our development officer, Sean Lay. Sarah Wiley, operations manager, Daryl and Tell right there. We're all lined up for a quick photograph. This was actually 4 days after they found Western Reserve. We're all smiling, but we weren't super happy at this point because the weather really kicked up as soon as we got out there. So you can't launch the ROV if the weather's too rough. So we came back, we smiled for the camera, but 2-3 days after that, we went back out again, and we were able to get calmer water. We went out of Grand Marais each time, which is closer, much closer than going 60 miles out of Whitefish Point. So we were able to launch that ROV. At this point, you try to imagine out on the deck, we've got several people tending this tether that has to be fed out. Inside that tether has all the fiber optics for that ROV itself, and through those fiber optics, we get the images of the shipwreck that we're seeing. Some of us are inside the cabin. All the curtains are closed inside the cabin of the vessel, so it's nice and dark. You can see what's coming up on the monitors, and this is what we started to see as soon as that ROV. Wow. This wasn't the first thing that we saw, but it was the second thing. This was the foremast of that vessel. Look how it snapped, and that bell is like in perfect condition. We kept trying to get the ROV closer. Daryl was piloting the ROV, tried to get it closer to get the name, see if the name was on it. Often the names would be on the bells. But there was no name on this one that we could see. There's a different view you could see coming from a different angle. Just broken like a matchstick there. But there was one artifact that we really, really wanted to see. Because there was only one artifact that we are aware of. There's only one that we're aware of that's in existence at this point. And it happens to be one of the running lights off the ship. It's the starboard running light. And we really wanted to see if the port light was still on it. And the port light, believe it or not, was one of the very first things that we saw. And you'll see that here in a second. Now, this is part of the boiler house. And one thing that Harry Stewart, look, the doors hanging open there too, it's just torn up, blown up. One thing that Harry Stewart recalls is that when that number 2 lifeboat was pulling away, they heard this explosion. Anybody guess what that might have been? The boiler's exploding, and it destroyed that boiler house at the same time. Look how that's all twisted up at the same time. But now this is what we wanted to see. We're coming up near the bow area. Look, you can still see the white paint, see the portholes. And this was really one of the first things. So this is sort of out of order. But one of the first things we saw, you could just see right up there, and we were really excited at this point because we're kind of geeks here. Anyways, we get excited about this stuff. But we knew that the one artifact in existence down at the National Museum of the Great Lakes was the starboard running light. And we wanted to see how close this thing matched up with that artifact that just so happens to be down in Toledo, Ohio at this point. There's a story behind that, how that got there too. But as we got closer, can you make out, almost make out the color of that lens? It's red. There's our port running light. And if we needed even a little more evidence that this was our port running light, Daryl's gonna get the ROV in really, really close here. I'm just amazed at how that paint all these years later still on that ship. He's going to nose it in, trying not to hit it at the same time. And he's adjusting the lighting. And there's a little bit of scroll work. Can you see it appearing now? And you could just make out the word port right there.
Oh, yeah.
And we were so excited about that at this point. So we knew, not only from the fact that this was a steel vessel, the fact that it was broken too. The other vessel he talked about was a collision, so it would have shown a little bit differently on the bottom of the lake. I can't tell you, it's hard to convey how excited we were inside the cabin of that vessel at this point. I mean, there was like a small celebration, more donuts were being eaten, things like that, so there was a lot of enthusiasm there. But we had to remind ourselves of a couple things here, right? So we were just on this ship, and we had to remind ourselves, for one, 27 people died on this shipwreck. So there was a little bit of sometimes you think about these things, sometimes you don't, but I think this one particularly was a little heart-wrenching, thinking in terms of the kids being on board, the family, everything else. Again, the reason we know so much is because of Harry W. Stewart. But yeah, multiple families working on this ship. If you count Albert Meyer's son, the wheelsman, who almost made it to shore as well. Pictures like this were showing up in some of the different maritime publications from the day, because these were all well-known sailors, officers on the Great Lakes ships. People knew them. This was a big fleet. Myers is one of the most accomplished ship captains. Seaman was one of the most accomplished engineers, and of course Peter Minch, he owned it all. Now, I mentioned that starboard running light had a story behind it. There was a couple stories. But one, you can see it showed up in a newspaper article from 1941. You can see it right there. It looks identical to the one that's still on the ship. People have asked, well, how does a metal thing like that get ashore? Well, I don't know if you caught that it was on this wooden, whatever. It was on this board, basically, and that floated ashore on the Canadian side, near kind of the Mass Harbor, that area. You know where that is? Maybe an hour or so north of Sault Ste. Marie. It eventually made its way down to Philip Minch, who was the son of Peter Minch and Anna Minch. Peter Minch was the son that was helping run the company. He was not able to take the trip. By virtue of that, he lived. And there were also brothers and sisters that he had. Some of the newspapers sort of contradict this a little bit. Some of them made it sound like Philip was the only surviving son, but others that I've read said that there were younger brothers and sisters. But Philip ended up having this. Someone gave it to him. He put it on his house, and every night, in memory of his family, he'd light that starboard light up. That's part of the story. This is an interesting newspaper article, though, and I know you probably can't read this, but I'll read part of it for you. It says, the starboard ship's lantern, which for many years cast forth a green light from the front window of the home of the late Captain Philip Minch of Mentor, Ohio, will continue to keep its lonely vigil in memory of the captain's loved ones, lost at sea. It was placed in the window of the President James A. Garfield home in Mentor as well. During the pioneer days, now you've got to listen closely here, during the pioneer days on the Great Lakes, Captain Minch's parents perished when the freighter Western Reserve sank on its maiden voyage in a course of a raging gale on Lake Erie. Later, the lantern attached to some wreckage floated ashore on a bleak section of the Canadian coast. That part's true, but they're on the wrong Great Lake. We'll get up on Lake Superior. The lamp was obtained by Captain Minch, and he was kept burning day and night in memory of his parents. Recently, when the captain died, the lantern passed into the hands of the Western Reserve Historical Society, Lake County chapter, so on and so forth. So even some of those newspaper articles back then, they were getting the lake all wrong. It wasn't the maiden voyage, things like that. So sometimes it makes it a challenge. But here is the starboard light inside the National Museum of the Great Lakes. Have any of you been there before? No? That's interesting. I'll have to tell my friends that work down there that, because when I asked you how many have been to the Shipwreck Museum, every hand almost went up. None of us have been down to that. You need to go down there someday. It is really well done, very nicely done. But you can see they're actually going to loan us this. They have agreed to loan us this when we create an exhibit about the Western Reserve, so we're excited about that. There you can see the port light go back and forth. You can see it's the same one. Here's a friend of mine, Bob Campbell. He's the one that took that picture that I told you about of the Fitzgerald, 1975 summer, that very famous photograph. Bob has been harassing us for years, asking us if we were looking for the Western Reserve, and we found the Western Reserve yet, so on and so forth. It was about 2 weeks before we found it that he had called me again to ask if we were really trying to find the Western Reserve. And we actually found it, so I was happy. I thought that was rather ironic that he had reached out as well. And finally, another entry in the life-saving service, just a couple more, well, I shouldn't say a couple more slides here, but this is an interesting one. I'm not really into ghost stories, things like that. I think they're kind of interesting, but when you work at a historic site, sometimes it seems like people want to focus on those things a little bit much. Well, there is an interesting story behind this one that I find interesting, because the gentleman who told the story is someone who had no reason to make anything up, and he wasn't a person who was subject to being sensationalistic. Actually, I'm going to go back real quickly. There was a surfman, one of basically the guys in the life-saving service who would be out walking the beach. He was working his way up in a crew, and he started out at Deer Park. Young man by the name of Benjamin Trudell. Benjamin Trudell. He was a surfman, lower on the totem pole, like a private almost in the Army, if you want to think in those terms. One of the jobs that he would have would be to be out on beach patrol. Basically, you're walking that shoreline. It would be 24 hours a day. They would have these surfmen or storm warriors. You might hear those references as well. They would be out walking the beach, keeping an eye on the lake, and if they saw a ship in distress, particularly during a storm or during nasty weather, then their mission was to go back, get back to the station, alert their keeper or captain basically, and at that point the keeper would determine what was happening, what kind of tools, do we need to use a surf boat, do we need to get the beach card out, so on and so forth. They had all kinds of tools they could use. Well, Benjamin Trudell had a nightmare the night before. Actually, it would have been the same night that the ship sank. He had a nightmare that he was on beach patrol. This was documented decades after the ship sank. And when he was in a position of authority, he was actually the keeper of the Grand Marais station at that point. But he talked about this nightmare that he had where he was walking the shoreline and this very well-dressed man approached him, a man of importance, he would say in his words, approached him in the light and it was again, the ship was sinking out there that night, so it was a bad storm. But this man, this is in his dream, this man kept pointing out to the water, but he couldn't hear what he was saying, pointing out to the water, finally got in his face and kept pointing out to the water, and then the guy just disappeared. This was his nightmare. So he wakes up in a sweat, everything else, and goes about, does his beach patrol in the middle of the night, bad storm, everything else, probably thinking about this dream the whole time. Well, the next day, and this is from Keeper Fram's, from his ledger, he writes, September 1st, 1892, left Grand Marais at 6 a.m., followed the beach down to the boat, launched her with the crew, proceeded along the shore looking for bodies. Found a body of a lady near the water's edge face down in gravel, 9:30 a.m. 6.5 miles east of the station, found body of P.G. Minch, Peter G. Minch. His initials on charm and shirts and left arm, his body was fully dressed. Found a watch and chain, a pocket knife, $267.92 in money, good amount of money back then. The body of the lady was dressed in undergarments, 3 gold rings on her fingers, left hand, no initials to be found on her. We arrived at the station at noon, laid bodies out in clothing furnished by the Ladies' Aid Society, that was pretty common. Crew being on the beach all night before with no sleep, ordered them to turn in until 5:30. I started patrol at 6 p.m. No patrols from midnight to sunrise, crew away to wreck. Well, here's where Benjamin Trudell comes in. He was the surfman who found the body, Peter G. Minch, and turned it over, and that same face, that same person was the one he saw in his dream. Now, why would he make something like this up all those years later when he's in charge of a station at Grand Marais? It's just a strange story. It shows up in one of Fred Stonehouse's books, Haunted Lakes, too. Exactly. So these are good books, by the way. I'm not into the ghost stories so much, but these actually have some interesting stories in them. There's my ghost story. Now, finally, do you remember that I said there was another ship that was the sister ship, and these are the last couple slides here. Do you remember I mentioned there was steamship number 10, which was the W.H. Gilcher? That one sank 2 months later on Lake Michigan. It disappeared on Lake Michigan. Nobody's ever found it. They don't know what happened to it. They have no idea. It just vanished and left port, never to be seen again. So what happened? What happened to these 2 ships? This, as you can imagine, this became, think of the marine journals of the day, marine architects, engineers, everybody was trying to figure out what was happening with these 2 ships that everybody thought were the safest, staunchest, strongest ships in the fleet. There were a lot of accusations that were going around out in the newspapers of the day. Here's one, weak in construction. This came out of the Duluth Evening Herald. Loss of the Western Reserve sounds like a note of warning to experimental shipbuilders that will probably be heeded now that it has been accompanied by the frightful loss of life which has been recorded. In the strive to make large carriers cheaply, the elements of strength to a great degree have been neglected, and the apparent object of the shipbuilders has been to get just as little framework, just as much cargo space, and the greatest amount of speed at the smallest bill of expense. Here's one. Here's another. Defective structural weaknesses in the reserve West Bay City Shipyard foreman's charge. Worked in Cleveland when the boat was built, referring to the Western Reserve, but it also had to refer to the W.H. Gilcher at the same time. One of the foremen in J.W. Wheeler shipyards here has made a statement which will cause a sensation whenever the news of the Western Reserve's awful tragedy with its loss of 27 lives has penetrated. He was formerly a sub-foreman in the yards of Cleveland at which the Western Reserve was built. He claims to have made an affidavit before the hull inspector giving particulars as to the structural weaknesses not only in the reserve, but in other boats built at about the same time. That would be the W.H. Gilcher that he was referencing. Here's another one, Buffalo Inquirer, survivor of the Western Reserve disaster, Wheelsman Stewart, says positively in an answer to an inquiry that the steamer broke in 2, forcing her way into a big sea. The excitement among Captain Minch's friends of the disaster has caused much discussion regarding its cause. Well-informed vessel owners are satisfied that the boat was being rushed into head seas, as big steel steamers of her kind always are. Great dependence being put on the water bottom. It's thought that the boat was being unduly pushed on account of the owner being aboard. The steamer was doubtless out of the water for 100 feet each way as she rode. That's an interesting question or interesting thought. On the crest of each wave, had she been a wooden boat, the leak would have shown the danger, but being steel, the rivets holding her together broke all at once under the strain. Here's one of the very last ones, or the next to last one. The weather at the time of the disaster was not very stormy. The steamer Spokane now in this harbor passed Whitefish at the time the Western Reserve went down, and her officers agree in the statement that the sea was only a little bit rough. The accident teaches a lesson which should be a lasting one to the maritime world, that strength is fully as desirable as space, speed, or cheapness.
Oh my God.
This is how these things were being leveled in newspaper. Similar things were coming many, many years later when the Fitzgerald sank. All the theories as to why that ship would have sank, that's another little commonality the Western Reserve had. Incidentally, does anybody know what the Western Reserve, beyond the ship, what the Western Reserve is? Think of Case Western Reserve University. Yeah, it's down in Ohio. It's a massive tract of land down in Ohio. That's what the ship ended up being named after. Finally, last slide here, before I give thanks to all these individuals. The thing that they came back with, the reason it became the most commonly accepted as to why the Western Reserve sank was because it was built of what was called mild steel. Ships have broken up and gone down over the years. Think of the Carl D. Bradley, 1958. They talk about the steel, the kind of steel the ship was built of. Brittle steel. They talk about brittle steel. So when these ships twist and turn, the waves are having them going up and down, and some of these older ships, if they were built of a certain kind of steel, mild steel might be something similar to this, they would actually end up breaking versus twisting and hogging, as they call it, going up and down. Mild steel was what they ended up coming back with both the Gilcher. Again, nobody's found the Gilcher, and we only just found the Western Reserve. So it's not like anybody's really been able to study the steel on these ships, but they were able to understand the steel that was used in the production process, and that was what they came back with. Now, my last slide here, whenever we do a program like this, whenever we're researching these shipwrecks, we have a lot of people that are helping us out. Fred Stonehouse, we mentioned Fred. Beth, has Fred been here before? I can't remember.
Not yet.
He'd be a good one, especially if you want one of the Fitzgerald. He's the one that literally wrote the book. The first one that came out in 1977. I bought a copy myself when I was 11 years old. I tell Fred that. He doesn't seem to like that for some reason. But I still have that copy. It's wrinkled up, coffee spilled on it, everything else. But Fred helped us tremendously research. Another researcher in the Marquette area, Dan Fountain, he's helped us find a couple shipwrecks. Mike Spears, he's down in the Detroit area. Tons of research. Rick Mixter, I think most of you know Rick. He had amazing amounts of primary sources, newspaper articles that he shared. Bob Campbell for the artwork, and Robert McGreevy, who also helped us with research. He's the one that kept harassing us to find it. So with that, last slide. Thank you everybody for joining me. I know I went over on time. People have restaurant reservations, I'm sure.
I was gonna say, we do still have time though. If anybody has questions, please feel free to ask them. If you have to leave for your 7 o'clock reservation, we get it. But if we do have any questions, we have time.
Sir. Absolutely. Yeah, oh yeah. When it comes to ROV, we have people lining up. There's
I was supposed to sign in here, but I have a 4-pair of
Oh,
cards.
you know Sean? Okay. Shipwreck Society.
We'll see.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah, Sean's a great guy. He's one of our more, he's a character. How's that? So, yeah, he looks about the same, just a little heavier, a little very much so. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
How many ships have sunk within the Great Lakes, Michigan, Huron, Superior, maybe even Lake St. Clair, which I'm more familiar with? And how many of those came apart in the center? Because I've got a lot of sailing experience on Lake St. Clair, right at the mouth of the Detroit River, a lot of racing. And, I was forever dodging operators.
Oh, I'm sure.
But you look at the length of these things and having a little bit of engineering knowledge, you go, why would you do this? How many split in the center?
That's a great question. I mean, the first part of your question, some statistics say 6,000 shipwrecks in the Great Lakes. Others say 10,000.
Yeah, I've heard both numbers.
Exactly. It's hard. It's really hard to tell because the way the newspapers kept track of these things, it's a tough thing. Now, as far as how many ships broke in two, I don't think I can answer that question. I mean, we know of like the obvious examples, the Daniel J. Morrell, 1966, the Carl D. Bradley, 1958, obviously the Western Reserve, 1892. As far as we know, the W.H. Gilcher, also 1892. There's others, oh boy, I don't know, that's a tough question. A lot of the ones in our area, which I tend to know better, I say our area up near Whitefish Point, a lot of those tend to be, believe it or not, collision. A lot of ships running into each other up there, primarily because of the fog. Smoke from forest fires, things like that would obscure. And if you get the combination of the two, forget it. You should drop anchor and just not go anywhere unless you're on the middle of the lake. But a lot of the problem, human error was a big problem, and also people who would not slow down. So you have a ship that's going full steam ahead, literally, through a really foggy area. So we have a lot of instances where these ships slammed into each other, and some of them broke in half that way. That's a different story, because literally they're almost severed in two, and they sink. But that's a great question. I can't answer it.
Well, from an engineering standpoint, you just look at it and you shake your head.
Yeah, I know. I mean, you didn't hear the wooden ships breaking in two, but the steel ones in the Western Reserve, the Gilcher, was such a new concept. I mean, they also had the ships that were called composite freighters. They were part wood, part steel. They might be a wooden hulled ship with a steel framework and things like that. That was kind of like a halfway point. And some of them were even built after the all steel ships were there. But it's a great question. Something for these guys to help me research here and see if we can get an answer to it. So.
Okay, well, the rivets back in those days weren't worth anything.
Probably not. And again, the steel they were using wasn't, I think they thought they were using pretty stout stuff.
I understand metal shear.
Yeah, they weren't quite. I mean, you wonder about the 1,000 footers that are out there at this point. That's a lot of shit out there. But I know. The Fitzgerald was another one. I mean, there are some theorize that it broke in two, right? So like Jacques Cousteau, his son, was leading that expedition, and that was their conclusion, that it broke apart on the surface. But then every other, except for this gentleman who mentioned that he found a body, his conclusion was also that it broke into on the surface. But every other expedition out there said, no way. That thing took a nosedive, went to the bottom. The bow plowed in, so on and so forth. Here we are talking about the Fitzgerald again. But it's what everybody wants to talk about, it seems like.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for coming, everybody. Sorry we ran over there.